Everyone's watching the heat, everyone's watching the storms, but almost nobody's watching the one detail that could make this week far worse than it looks on paper. And it's sitting quietly in the Atlantic Ocean. Stick with me, because by the end of this, you'll understand exactly why forecasters keep glancing nervously at a stretch of ocean that, on the surface, looks completely calm. Let's get into it. Right now, the country is split into two very different stories. On one side, a dome of high pressure has settled over the central and southern plains, and it is not going anywhere fast. That dome is acting like a lid on a pot, trapping heat underneath it and pushing thermometers into territory that sounds almost fictional. Parts of southern Kansas and northern Oklahoma have already seen heat index values climb past 110, with some spots flirting with 115. That's not a typo, and it's not an exaggeration. That's the kind of heat that turns a normal afternoon outside into a genuine medical emergency within the hour. And this heat isn't a one-day scare that blows through and moves on. It's been sitting there for days, and it's expected to hold on stubbornly into the middle of next week before it finally starts to break. On the other side of the country, along the northern edge of that same heat dome, the atmosphere is doing the exact opposite of sitting still. That's where the storm track lives right now, and it has been firing off round after round of severe thunderstorms across the upper Midwest, the Great Lakes, and even reaching into the East Coast. Damaging straight-line wind is the headline threat in most of these events. The kind of gust that can snap tree limbs, rip down power lines, and leave entire neighborhoods without electricity for a night or two. Large hail has been part of the package as well, especially across the higher terrain of the plains, where these storms tend to grow tall and mean this time of year. Here's where the forecast starts to get genuinely interesting, because this isn't just one storm rolling through and clearing out. This is a pattern that keeps reloading, day after day. And the reason it keeps reloading is worth understanding, because once you see the mechanism, the rest of the forecast makes a lot more sense. There's a broad area of low pressure sitting up in Canada, and because of exactly where it's parked, it's been sending waves of energy rotating around its edge and down into the northern plains and the upper Midwest. Each of those waves acts like its own mini-storm generator, capable of sparking a fresh round of severe weather even while the last round is still cleaning up. Meteorologists at the Storm Prediction Center have been watching this exact setup, and their extended outlook points to an elongated corridor of thunderstorm and wind potential, stretching from the northern plains through the Midwest and Great Lakes, with some signs it could even reach into the Northeast before this is all finished. Now, the reason this coming Sunday keeps getting singled out isn't random. It comes down to the ingredients lining up in a very specific and very favorable way for organized, dangerous storms. You need three things for a severe weather day to have real teeth. Instability, which is essentially fuel. Wind shear, which is the twisting and turning of wind speed and direction with height that allows a storm to organize instead of just fizzling out. And enough moisture to keep the whole system fed. On Sunday, forecasters are watching all three of those ingredients climb into a genuinely impressive range across parts of the northern plains and into the upper Midwest. When instability numbers get that high and the wind profile turns the way it's expected to, you don't just get scattered showers. You get the kind of environment that can spin up supercells, the most organized and most dangerous form of thunderstorm there is, capable of producing large hail and strong long-track tornadoes. I want to be honest with you, the way any good forecaster should be honest with you. Predictability, this far out, is genuinely low. The storm. Prediction Center itself has flagged that the exact placement of the front and how quickly storms fire and organize each day carries real uncertainty even just a few days in advance. That uncertainty is not a reason to ignore the setup. It's a reason to stay aware and keep checking updates as the week goes on, because a high ceiling day like this can either fizzle into something modest, or it can turn into the kind of night that ends up on the news. Either way, if you live anywhere from the northern plains through the upper Midwest and into the Great Lakes, this is the stretch of days where you want a reliable way to receive weather alerts, whether that's a phone with warnings enabled or a weather radio sitting somewhere in your house. Zoom in on the timeline for a moment, because the storm threat isn't just one single day sitting out there in isolation. It's a chain of days, each one connected to the last. Early in the stretch, the action has mostly been concentrated across the upper Midwest, with clusters of storms firing during the afternoon and pushing eastward through the evening, bringing pockets of damaging wind and small hail along a corridor that's touched cities from the Great Lakes down toward the Ohio Valley. There's usually a quieter day mixed in somewhere along the way, a bit of a breather before the next wave arrives, which is worth mentioning because not every day in an active pattern like this is a blockbuster. But then the flow shifts, the low-level winds swing around, and the whole system ramps back up again, setting the stage for that high-ceiling day everyone keeps circling on the calendar. Once that day passes, the pattern doesn't just shut off. Guidance suggests the same general corridor keeps getting reloaded into the following days, with the focus sliding eastward toward Indiana, Ohio, and Illinois, and then back westward again toward Iowa and Wisconsin as the boundary sort of rocks back and forth across the region. That kind of repetition matters, because when the same areas get hit by round after round of storms, it's not just wind and hail you have to worry about. All that rain adds up fast, and soaked ground that's already taken a beating from earlier storms has nowhere left to send the water, which is exactly how localized flooding turns into a much bigger regional problem within just a few days. So that's the heat, and that's the storms. Two very real, very visible threats that are already making headlines across the country. But here's the part almost nobody's talking about, and it's the reason I wanted to make this video in the first place. While all of this plays out across the middle of the country, the Atlantic Ocean has been unusually, almost eerily quiet. This year, though, that ramp-up simply hasn't happened the way it usually does. As of early August, the basin has produced only a couple of named storms, well behind the pace you'd expect based on decades of averages, and not a single hurricane has formed yet this season, for a point in the calendar that's supposed to be heating up in every sense of the word. That's a striking gap. The reason behind the quiet comes down to a familiar name in weather circles, El Niño. This year's El Niño has been strengthening through the summer, and one of its signature effects on the Atlantic is a sharp increase in wind shear across the basin. Think of wind shear as an invisible pair of scissors sitting up in the atmosphere. When a tropical wave tries to organize into something more serious, that shear tears at the top of the developing storm, ripping the structure apart before it ever gets the chance to spin up into anything dangerous. On top of that shear, there's also been a persistent layer of dry, dusty air streaming off the Sahara Desert and drifting westward across the Atlantic. That dust doesn't just look hazy in satellite images. It actively starves storms of the moisture they need to grow, adding yet another obstacle in the way of anything trying to develop. Put those two forces together, strong shear tearing storms apart and dry Saharan air choking off their moisture supply, and you get exactly what we're seeing right now. A basin that looks almost lifeless on the satellite loop while the rest of the country deals with heat records and severe weather outbreaks. It's worth pointing out that this isn't just a vague feeling among forecasters. Long-range model guidance from multiple major forecasting centers has consistently shown few, if any, signs of organized development anywhere in the basin over the coming weeks, which is unusual for a stretch of the calendar that historically produces a noticeable uptick in activity. Even the handful of tropical waves that have rolled off the African coast this summer have struggled to hold together, falling apart under the same hostile conditions before they ever got close to earning a name. Forecasters have leaned into this trend hard. Seasonal outlooks that were already calling for a below-normal year back in the spring have only gotten quieter with each update since. The most recent projections call for somewhere in the range of 7 to 13 named storms for the entire season, well under the long-term average of around 14, with only a handful of those expected to strengthen into hurricanes at all. Some forecasters have gone as far as raising the odds of a below-normal season to as high as 3 and 4, which is a striking level of confidence this early in what's supposed to be the most active stretch of the year. On the surface, that sounds like good news. And in a lot of ways, it genuinely is. Fewer storms brewing generally means fewer immediate threats bearing down on coastlines, fewer evacuation scares, fewer sleepless nights for families along the Gulf and East coasts. If you live anywhere near the water, a quieter season is not something to complain about. But here's the detail that almost nobody is talking about, and it's the reason I opened this video the way I did. A quiet season is not the same thing as a safe season, and the ocean doesn't just forget about all the energy it's been storing up while the atmosphere keeps a lid on things. Ocean heat content has been building through the summer, largely undisturbed, because there haven't been storms around to churn it up and release it the way an active season naturally would. That stored energy doesn't disappear. It sits there, layer after layer of warm water, waiting for the right set of conditions to unlock it. And if even one storm manages to find a gap in that hostile wind shear, a brief lull where the atmosphere relaxes just enough, it can tap into all of that accumulated heat and intensify rapidly, sometimes within a matter of hours rather than days. This is exactly the scenario that keeps meteorologists from ever fully relaxing during a quiet stretch, no matter how good the numbers look on a seasonal outlook. History is full of examples of seasons that started slow, stayed quiet for weeks or even months, and then produced a single storm that caught everyone off guard, specifically because expectations had dropped so low. It only takes one. That phrase gets repeated so often in hurricane coverage that it almost sounds like a cliche, but it exists because it keeps being true, year after year, storm after storm. A season can finish well below the long-term average and still be remembered for decades because of one specific landfall in one specific place at one specific time. Think about how strange that is for a moment. A season can rack up a below-average total, number of named storms across an entire 6-month stretch, and yet still end up being the season people talk about for years, simply because one storm found the right gap in the atmosphere at exactly the wrong moment for whoever happened to be in its path. That's the uncomfortable truth about quiet seasons that a lot of casual coverage tends to gloss over in favor of a simpler, more comforting headline. So while the Atlantic sits quiet for now, with the next storms on the name list waiting in line and no organized development expected in the immediate future, that quiet is doing something underneath the surface that deserves just as much attention as the noise happening everywhere else this week. The heat dome over the plains is dramatic and visible. The severe storm outbreaks rolling through the Midwest are dramatic and visible. They make for great headlines and dramatic radar loops. The Atlantic sitting there, warm and undisturbed, doesn't make for nearly as exciting a story right up until the moment it does. Let me bring this back to the bigger picture, because I think it's easy to focus on whichever threat feels loudest in the moment and miss how connected all of this actually is. The same broad pattern that's kept the heat dome anchored over the plains and kept firing storms along its northern edge is part of a larger atmospheric setup that's also playing a role in how the tropics are behaving. It's not a coincidence that we're dealing with extreme heat, repeated severe weather outbreaks, and an unusually quiet hurricane season all within the same stretch of days. These are pieces of the same broader pattern, each one shaped by the position of ridges and troughs sitting thousands of feet above our heads, deciding where the heat bakes, where the storms fire, and where the tropics get shut down before they can even get started. If you're anywhere near the heat dome right now, across Kansas, Oklahoma, and the surrounding region, please take it seriously even if it doesn't feel dramatic compared to a tornado on the news. Heat is consistently one of the deadliest weather hazards in this country every single year, precisely because it doesn't come with dramatic footage. It sneaks up on people quietly, especially the elderly, young children, and anyone without reliable access to air conditioning. Check on your neighbors, never leave anyone or any pet in a parked car even for a few minutes, and treat the middle of the day as a time to stay indoors rather than push through it. If you're anywhere from the northern plains through the upper Midwest and into the Great Lakes, keep a close eye on the days ahead, especially as Sunday approaches. The ingredients are lining up for a genuinely dangerous setup, and while nothing is guaranteed this far in advance, a high-ceiling day like this deserves your attention well before storms start showing up on radar. Have a way to get warnings that will wake you up if severe weather rolls through overnight, because some of the more dangerous scenarios in a pattern like this tend to unfold after dark, when visibility is at its worst and people are least prepared to react quickly. And if you live anywhere along the Gulf Coast or the Atlantic seaboard, don't let a quiet start to the season lull you into skipping your preparations this year. Know your evacuation zone, have a plan for your family and your pets, and keep an emergency kit ready, not because a storm is imminent right now, but because the ocean is holding on to energy that could turn a quiet week into a very different situation with surprisingly little warning. The forecasters watching this pattern aren't panicking, but they are paying close attention, and that's exactly the posture worth adopting for yourself too. Stay informed, stay ready, and don't assume that quiet automatically means safe. It costs you nothing to have a plan sitting ready in a drawer somewhere, and it can save you precious hours if the atmosphere ever does find that gap it's been looking for. A little bit of preparation now while everything still looks calm on the map is always easier than scrambling for it once a storm is already spinning offshore and closing in on the coast. That's the full picture as it stands right now. A heat dome refusing to budge over the plains, a storm track locked in and reloading day after day across the Midwest and Great Lakes, a genuinely important setup building towards Sunday, and underneath all of it, an Atlantic Ocean that looks calm on the surface while quietly stacking up energy that forecasters are watching far more closely than the empty satellite loop might suggest. Keep an eye on the updates as the week develops, because a pattern this layered can shift quickly, and the difference between a routine week and a genuinely dangerous one often comes down to catching those shifts early. Thanks for watching, and I'll be back with the next update as this whole picture comes further into focus. If any of this changes in the days ahead, whether that's the tropics waking up or Sunday's setup sharpening into something more certain, you'll hear about it here first. Until then, stay safe out there.